Beneath the ashes of war and the frost of the Cold War lies a silence that speaks louder than records ever could. It is the silence of corridors bricked shut, of trunks locked away in forgotten vaults, of ink blacked out line by line until only shadows remain. Imagine archives where whole shelves are empty, yet dust patterns reveal what once stood there. Imagine maps marked not with borders but with absences, blank spaces where memory was excised. Every whisper from those voids carries the weight of buried intentions, experiments hidden under the roar of engines, alliances erased by the stroke of a censor's pen, truths deliberately starved of oxygen. These stories do not live in headlines or textbooks. They reside in fragments of half-burnt pages, in the recollections of survivors who never spoke aloud, in the tension between what was known and what was never meant to be seen. And still, the silence persists. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Convoy of Murmansk. On June 27, 1942, Convoy PQ-17 sailed from Valkyrie, Iceland, bound for Arkhangelsk, with 35 merchant ships, carrying over 200,000 tons of war material. It was meant to be a lifeline for the Soviet Union, one of the most dangerous supply missions of the war. Escorting them were 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, and a screen of armed trawlers. Official records tell the story of tragedy. The Admiralty ordered the convoy to scatter under threat of the German battleship Tirpitz, leaving the merchants defenseless against U-boats and Luftwaffe torpedo bombers. 24 ships were sunk, more than 2/3 of the convoy lost. But buried in fragments of intelligence files lies a parallel narrative rarely discussed outside of classified rooms. Several merchant ships carried crates that were not listed in manifests, coded with the words "Special Cargo for Moscow" under seal of the British Ministry of Supply. Soviet archives, when they could be accessed in the 1990s, referred to the same material using the phrase Device R-17, a designation never explained in open literature. According to a declassified but heavily redacted MI6 cable dated July 1, 1942, 3 days after departure, reports surfaced of an unmarked trawler shadowing the convoy. Survivors recalled seeing the vessel at night, lights doused, its silhouette low and squat against the horizon. It never appeared on Allied or Soviet naval registers. Sailors spoke of its crew wearing mismatched uniforms, neither naval nor merchant, and its presence was quietly noted in Admiralty Situation Report 2-11442. The trawler was observed alongside the freighter Silver Sword on July 3rd, before disappearing into the fog. When Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographed the convoy later that day, the trawler did not appear. Among the lost ships was the SS Empire Byron, carrying aircraft, vehicles, and rumoured communications machinery packed in lead-lined crates. In 1967, Norwegian fishermen dragging nets near Novaya Zemlya reported hauling up twisted metal marked with English stenciling and a fragment stamped "Property of HMG Communications Section." Within days, Soviet naval authorities cordoned off the area, declared it a restricted zone, and confiscated all retrieved debris. Western intelligence only learned of the incident after a defector in 1974 revealed the Soviet files referred to the find as Object Murman. NATO analysts speculated that PQ-17 had carried radar, countermeasure technology under development by the British, equipment that, if salvaged, could have influenced early Soviet radar designs. American archives also contain anomalies. A War Department memorandum from 1948 references recoverable Enigma apparatus lost with PQ-17, though no official record confirms that such devices were aboard. The hypothesis persists that captured German cipher machines, intended for Moscow's cryptologic center, were concealed aboard several merchants. If true, their loss in the Barents Sea represented not only a strategic disaster, but a blow to Soviet code-breaking efforts. It also explains why Allied interest in recovering PQ-17 wrecks resurfaced in the 1950s, long after the war had ended. The survivors of PQ-17 told stories never written into naval histories. Lieutenant Harold Simmons of HMS Keppel described in his diary an unregistered freighter trailing the convoy even after the order to scatter. He wrote that its crew made no SOS, no radio signal, simply vanished into the fog. Simmons's diary, later recovered by his son in 1979, was deposited with the Imperial War Museum but remains partly unpublished. Another survivor, a Soviet sailor named Yuri Antonov, testified in 1961 during a private veterans meeting in Leningrad that one ship carried something Stalin himself demanded. We were told it must not be captured. If sinking was unavoidable, scuttling orders were given. His statement was not preserved in official transcripts. Why the files remain classified, even today, lies in the Cold War legacy of PQ-17. In 1959, the CIA conducted a covert diving expedition in the Barents Sea under Project Aurora, ostensibly to study Arctic salvage techniques. The target coordinates overlapped precisely with known wrecks of PQ-17 ships. Reports from the mission remain classified, but Soviet counterintelligence claimed American divers recovered sensitive Allied cargo from a sunken British vessel. Soon afterward, Soviet military established a permanent presence on Novaya Zemlya, officially for nuclear testing. Unofficially, naval patrols restricted all foreign access to wreck sites. The archival fragments create a picture both incomplete and unsettling. Why would radar countermeasure equipment, if indeed present, be sent through such a dangerous convoy route? Why was an unmarked trawler, never acknowledged by any navy, seen among the fleet? And why, 2 decades later, did both superpowers expend resources attempting to salvage the same wrecks? The silences are as revealing as the fragments themselves. PQ-17 was more than a tragedy of lost lives and ships. It was a shadow operation concealed within a legitimate mission, its purpose obscured by time, censorship, and the cold waters of the Barents Sea. For historians, the unanswered questions linger like frost on steel. The special cargo for Moscow remains undefined. The term Device R-17 has no explanation in Soviet or Allied nomenclature. The trawler that vanished into fog was never logged again in Arctic waters. Survivors who spoke of it were dismissed as confused, their recollections buried in personal diaries and scattered testimonies. Yet each fragment points toward the possibility that PQ-17 carried more than supplies for the Eastern Front. It carried secrets so critical that both sides preferred silence to acknowledgement. In war, truth often sinks with the ships. Chapter 2, Operation Eclipse and the Hidden Reich. On April 22, 1945, while the Red Army closed its ring around Berlin, Anglo-American forces pushed into central Germany under a plan codenamed Operation Eclipse. The official objective was simple: secure Germany's command centers, disarm remaining Wehrmacht units, and prevent Nazi leadership from establishing a government in exile in the Bavarian Alps. What the archives suggest, however, is a second layer buried under that directive, one that speaks less of occupation and more of acquisition. In the hills of Thuringia, near the town of Ohrdruf, American infantrymen stumbled upon a complex of tunnels that had not appeared on any pre-war maps. It was known by locals only as Jonastal. Within its concrete chambers were stacks of technical documents, design boards, and sealed crates bearing the insignia of the Reich Ministry of Armaments. Some contained V-2 rocket schematics, others diagrams of jet engines beyond the scope of contemporary aviation, and in several cases papers stamped with the cryptic words Sonnenrad Project. None of these finds appeared in official after-action reports. Instead, they were quietly transferred to US custody under the cover of technical intelligence. Survivors of the 89th Infantry Division, which took part in clearing the site, later recalled being ordered not to speak of what they saw. Sergeant Charles McVeigh described railcars parked within the tunnels, half loaded with crates, guarded not by Wehrmacht soldiers, but by men in black uniforms whose insignia had been hastily removed. He noted one crate smashed open by artillery fire, revealing glass cylinders filled with an unknown metallic powder, hastily swept up by accompanying officers. When questioned after the war, McVeigh's testimony was dismissed as exaggeration. Yet in 1993, a partially declassified US Army Air Technical Service Command document referenced the Ohrdruf materials in connection with early studies on propulsion and high-altitude flight. The document contained no technical data, only blacked-out pages, but its existence confirmed that something of value had been recovered. Parallel to Jonastal, records from the OSS reveal that Operation Eclipse authorized supplemental teams to move independently of regular army units. These teams, sometimes described as T-forces, were tasked with securing scientists, engineers, and their archives before the Soviets could. In one decrypted message dated May 5, 1945, a US intelligence officer reported that train shipments from Gotha were secured at night by Eclipse detachment. No train manifests survive, But Soviet intelligence complained bitterly after the war that entire carloads of technical documents had vanished before their arrival. Eyewitnesses in Gotha recalled trains leaving under heavy guard in the final days of April, their contents never seen again. The post-war program known as Operation Paperclip is well documented, bringing German scientists like Wernher von Braun to the United States. But scattered references in CIA memos suggest that not all personnel came through paperclip channels. In a 1952 memorandum concerning aerospace projects, one analyst noted several consultants acquired during Eclipse, not listed under paperclip rosters. These unnamed figures were said to provide unique data from Sonnenrad files, though no explanation was offered. Sonnenrad, or Black Sun, has since become synonymous with Nazi mysticism in fringe literature. Yet in the context of the declassified papers, it appears not as a cult symbolism, but as a code name for a technical project, one perhaps related to advanced energy research. Whether this connection is genuine remains uncertain, but the persistence of the name in secure files raises questions. Even in British archives, traces of Eclipse's hidden agenda emerge. A Foreign Office briefing from July 1945 makes reference to classified enclosures from Operation Eclipse, unsuitable for Allied dissemination. The note was handwritten on the margin of a report about German atomic research, and the enclosure was never attached. British parliamentarians who later pressed for clarification were told the files had been misplaced. Yet fragments reappear in 1958, when a Ministry of Defense scientist writing on nuclear propulsion mentioned early German field concepts secured in Thuringia. His letter, later censored, survives only in draft. Why this silence? One explanation lies in the early Cold War competition. If indeed Eclipse yielded not only scientists, but tangible experimental technology, neither Washington nor London had incentive to reveal its scope. The Soviets, denied access to Jonastal before American forces swept through, later built their own narratives about German Wunderwaffen captured in the East. Yet Soviet complaints consistently targeted Eclipse, accusing the Allies of concealing vast amounts of war spoils. In 1946, the NKVD filed an internal report titled Western Plunder of German Science, which specifically cited disappearances of Sonnenrad materials. The document remained classified until the 1990s. For local Germans, the memory of Eclipse is tied to secrecy and silence. Villagers in Arnstadt spoke of explosions heard from the tunnels in the summer of 1945, long after the war had ended. Some believe the Americans destroyed sections of Jonastal to conceal what they had taken. Others insist that certain chambers remain sealed, entrances collapsed by bulldozers. Rumors of underground chambers persist, feeding speculation about what was hidden there. Occasional expeditions by amateur historians have uncovered rusted rail ties, broken concrete, and fragments of technical drawings washed into the open by rain. Nothing conclusive, but enough to suggest the official story is incomplete. What is certain is that Operation Eclipse was far more than an occupation directive. The public-facing mission masked a deeper pursuit of technology and intelligence that shaped the coming conflict between East and West. The archival gaps are telling. Entire files withdrawn, names omitted, references blacked out. Where one expects clear documentation, one finds silence. Where survivors spoke of crates, tunnels, and trains, the record grows thin. The traces of Eclipse exist not in what is said, but in what has been carefully withheld. In the end, the closing days of the war in Germany were not only about defeat and surrender. They were about possession, of knowledge, of scientists, of the future itself. The Allies did not merely dismantle a Reich. They dissected it, scavenging from its remains what could be turned against a new adversary. Eclipse, in its concealed dimension, was less about ending one war than about preparing for the next. And like the tunnels of Jonastal, much of what it contained remains sealed in darkness, waiting for the light of disclosure that never seems to come. Chapter 3. The Ghost Prison of Bäreninsel. In the frozen expanse of the Barents Sea lies Bäreninsel, or Bear Island, a desolate rock of tundra and cliffs halfway between mainland Norway and Svalbard. Official records describe it only as a weather station during the Second World War, briefly occupied by German Kriegsmarine personnel. Yet fragments of Soviet files tell of a facility whose purpose was far darker. Declassified in part during the late 1980s, NKVD memoranda refer to Object 27, established on the island in early 1945. allegedly under the guise of a meteorological outpost. Its function, according to intercepted communications and testimony from local fishermen, was not atmospheric data collection, but containment. The prisoners held there were not ordinary POWs. They were German scientists and technicians seized from Norway during the collapse of Operation Weserübung, men suspected of involvement in unconventional weapons development. The origins of the facility appear in an intercepted German Navy message from February 1945, mentioning scientific personnel evacuated north. No ship logs exist, but Soviet records describe a convoy that departed Tromsø, diverted by Soviet naval units, and never reached its destination. By March, Object 27 was operational under NKVD oversight, commanded by Major Sergei Karpov. The island's remoteness ensured total isolation. Supply runs were conducted monthly from Murmansk, escorted by patrol vessels. What transpired on Bäreninsel never entered the official Soviet military histories, but survivors of Arctic fishing communities recalled warnings not to approach its shores. Those who did spoke of barbed wire, watchtowers, and the constant hum of generators that had no place on a weather station. Prisoner rosters vanished after the war, but scattered testimonies provide hints. In 1952, a captured German officer interrogated in East Germany described colleagues disappeared to a northern island, forced to assist in chemical dispersal experiments. His statement was dismissed as fabrication. Yet fragments of Norwegian intelligence archives mention sightings of Soviet aircraft circling Bear Island in late 1945, dropping canisters into test zones offshore. Fishermen who returned later reported shoals of dead fish and a slick of strange residue. Western analysts at the time suspected Soviet testing of nerve agents captured from German stockpiles. What makes the record disturbing is that these activities coincided with documented Soviet interest in a so-called radiological weapon, sometimes referred to in translated documents as a dirty bomb. Whether Bear Island was used as a proving ground remains unresolved. Soviet engineers who worked briefly on the island left veiled remarks decades later. One technician, interviewed anonymously in 1989, recalled underground bunkers carved into permafrost and sealed chambers where the air burned the lungs. He described prisoners marched into those chambers and emerging dazed, coughing blood. His account was never corroborated, but it aligns with references in NKVD budgetary documents to special protective equipment delivered to Object 27 in mid-1945. The equipment was identical to what Soviet chemical units later used during Cold War testing. If true, Bear Island was not a prison in the conventional sense, but a laboratory with living test subjects. Attempts to verify the site after the war met sudden resistance. In 1957, a joint Norwegian-British expedition sought to map the island's caves, but their vessel was wrecked in what was officially termed a storm. Survivors claimed Soviet naval units appeared in the vicinity hours before their ship ran aground. In the 1970s, US satellite reconnaissance captured images of rectangular ruins on Bear Island's southern cliffs, structures too large for weather huts. When analysts flagged the anomaly, the report was buried under higher security classification. To this day, the remains are listed in NATO databases simply as former Soviet facility, purpose unknown. The Cold War deepened the silence. Soviet files released in the early 1990s contained brief references to Project Seva 27, likely connected to Bear Island. Seva translates to north, reinforcing its geographical association. The documents noted the termination of the site in 1947, with materials transferred to Kishtim. Kishtim, of course, became notorious as one of the Soviet Union's earliest centers for nuclear research. The implication is unsettling, that prisoners and data from Bear Island contributed directly to Soviet radiological experimentation, later culminating in the Kishtim disaster of 1957. No Western archive has confirmed this link, but the circumstantial trail is undeniable. For the islanders of northern Norway, the legend of Bäreninsel persists as a whispered taboo. Fishermen still tell of rusted fences visible in the cliffs, of sealed concrete doors half buried by landslides. Norwegian patrols avoid the interior, citing environmental hazards, though no formal contamination survey has ever been published. In 1999, an independent research group attempted to land with Geiger counters, but was turned away by sudden, severe weather, despite calm conditions elsewhere in the Barents Sea. The group's leader claimed interference by unmarked vessels, shadowing their approach. Though unverified, The account mirrors earlier reports of unexplained surveillance in the area. The story of Bear Island exists only in fragments, pulled from scattered testimonies, censored files, and classified reconnaissance. There are no photographs of prisoners, no official rosters, no confirmed remains. What survives are hints. Object 27 in Soviet reports, Siva 27 in budgetary ledgers, and whispered testimony of men who lived long enough to describe sealed chambers in the ice. The lack of direct evidence is perhaps the strongest indicator of deliberate erasure. Facilities with nothing to hide do not vanish from every archive. Facilities conducting work too dangerous to admit, however, are buried as if they never existed. As the Cold War recedes into history, the Arctic remains littered with sites of secrecy. Among them, Bear Island holds a special place. Neither Germany nor the Soviet Union acknowledged its role. NATO knows more than it admits, yet says little. And for the few who have tried to pierce the silence, the only reward has been disappearance into obscurity. In the end, the ghost prison of Bäreninsel is less a story of confirmed fact than of the absence of fact, of silence shaped like a wound. Its legacy is not in the records that exist, but in the ones that were deliberately erased. Chapter 4. The Vanished Files of Dresden. On the night of February 13–14, 1945, Allied bombers turned Dresden into a sea of fire, killing tens of thousands and erasing one of Germany's most iconic cities. Beneath the flames, in the basements of the Reich Ministry of Armaments on Königsufer, officials scrambled to protect something other than lives. Crates of technical files and research reports prepared for transport. In the chaos of the firestorm, eyewitnesses saw uniformed men load sealed trunks onto trucks marked not with Wehrmacht insignia, but with plain tarpaulins. These convoys rolled westward, away from the advancing Soviets, under the escort of officers whose ranks had been stripped from their tunics. Survivors in Saxony recalled seeing them near Meissen on February 15th, after which all trace vanished. The documents never reappeared in post-war archives. What they contained, and why both Washington and Moscow fought to suppress their existence, remains one of the war's coldest. Enigmas.US Army records hold scattered references to the Dresden materials. In March 1945, a G2 intelligence report from the 1st Infantry Division noted the capture of German trunks in Saxony, containing technical papers on synthetic fuel production. Yet when the report was circulated, the appendix describing the crates was missing. Later, a memorandum dated 1951 surfaced in Air Technical Intelligence archives, referencing the Dresden materials in the context of reconnaissance aircraft. It contained no description of content, only a note that the papers were consulted during early design meetings for high-altitude projects. By 1952, the memo itself had been redacted. The anomaly was never explained. British sources echo the silence. The Ministry of Aircraft Production, in a confidential communication of June 1945, acknowledged receipt of experimental aero-engine data extracted from Dresden. The document was initialed by a senior official, yet the attached schematics were absent from the file. Parliamentary inquiries decades later were met with denials that such material had ever existed. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe veterans whispered that engineers working on long-range reconnaissance prototypes were evacuated to Saxony before the city's destruction. Some named Dr. Gerhard von Mertens, a specialist in high-altitude pressurization systems, who vanished after February 1945 and was rumored to have resurfaced in the United States under a new identity. No immigration record confirms this, but fragments of declassified CIA rosters list a Dr. Mertens as a consultant in Nevada during the 1950s. Soviet archives add another layer of mystery. Intercepted communications from February 1945 reveal Red Army frustration that Dresden's records had already been secured by the Western Allies. In 1946, NKVD agents interrogated captured German administrators, who insisted that critical technical files were removed by Americans before the Russians entered the city. Soviet. Historians later dismissed these claims as Western propaganda, but internal reports kept under lock and key suggest otherwise. A classified file known as Report 17-45 described Dresden as the most significant technical archive lost to Western seizure. The Soviets maintained their own search of the ruins, recovering fragments of research into synthetic fuels, but nothing approaching the scale described by their own. Interrogations. The technical significance of the missing files is hinted at only by scattered references. Allied scientists after the war pushed aggressively into synthetic fuel research, crucial for jet propulsion and long-range bombers. In both the United States and Britain, patents were filed in the late 1940s for processes suspiciously similar to German wartime experiments. Some scholars argue these advances were inevitable, converging from multiple sources. Yet the Dresden connection lingers. Why would US Air Technical Intelligence cite Dresden materials in relation to reconnaissance aircraft? Why would British ministries acknowledge papers extracted from the city, only to deny their existence years later? Civilian witnesses left their own fragments of testimony. Anna Richter, a Dresden clerk, recalled seeing crates marked with the phrase Sonderakten Treibstoff, special files fuel, in the ministry's cellar before the bombings. She swore that these were carried out by plainclothesmen in the days leading up to February 13th. Another survivor, a railway worker in Reich, testified to Allied investigators that he loaded trunks from Dresden onto freight cars bound west on February 16th, accompanied by English-speaking soldiers. His statement was never included in official transcripts. Instead, his testimony survived only in a personal letter preserved by his family. Uncovered decades later, in 1974, rumors surfaced of one trunk resurfacing in Bonn, Germany, during an investigation into wartime property seizures. The trunk allegedly contained carbonized fragments of technical documents, stamped with the Reich Ministry of Armaments seal. The Bundesarchiv took possession, but refused public access, citing contamination and deterioration. Requests by independent historians were rejected. When asked in 1982, a spokesman simply replied, "There is nothing of relevance to history within these containers." The ambiguity only deepened suspicion. The implications reach beyond fuel and aircraft. Some Cold War analysts believe the Dresden files may have contained information on advanced reconnaissance technology, possibly camera systems, high-altitude pressurization, or early radar absorption concepts. If so, their disappearance into Western hands would explain the sudden post-war acceleration of spy plane development. The U-2, for instance, emerged within a decade, its origins obscured by secrecy. Official histories attribute its design entirely to American innovation, yet the 1951 reference to Dresden materials sits uncomfortably against this narrative. Why then has the truth remained buried? The answer may lie in politics as much as science. Admitting to the seizure of Dresden's archives would confirm Allied plunder of technical knowledge promised to be shared under joint agreements. It would also raise moral questions about the deliberate exploitation of research conducted by a regime steeped in war crimes. Both East and West had motives to suppress the story. The Soviets could not admit to losing critical files. The West could not admit to concealing them. Thus, the silence became mutual, and the truth slipped into shadows. Today, Dresden is remembered for its devastation, the horror of the firestorm, and the cultural loss it inflicted. Yet beneath the ash, in files lost to time and secrecy, lies another story, a story of vanished documents that may have shaped the trajectory of Cold War technology. The convoys that rolled west under tarpaulins, the unmarked officers escorting trunks through Saxony, the redacted memos that refused to fade from the record, all point to a history withheld. The vanished files of Dresden are not merely about missing papers. They are about the deliberate burial of knowledge, seized in war, hidden in peace, and remembered only in the fragments that surface when the archives falter. Chapter 5. Codename Valkyrie's Shadow Network. On July 20th, 1944, the explosion inside the Wolf's Lair nearly killed Adolf Hitler. Official accounts focus on the conspirators' attempt to seize Berlin and negotiate peace with the Allies. Yet hidden among the interrogations and Allied after-action notes lies a deeper story. Valkyrie was not merely a coup, but also a conduit for information. German officers inside the plot had prepared caches of intelligence to hand over once the Nazi regime fell. These documents, coded under the name Schattenverbindung, the Shadow Network, outlined Gestapo hierarchies, U-boat deployments, and locations of concentration camps intended for Allied prosecutors. Many of these records never appeared at Nuremberg, raising the question, who intercepted them and why were they buried? Surviving fragments appear in OSS interrogation reports. One, dated August 1944, describes lists of Gestapo field officers compiled by Valkyrie associates, contents secured from Berlin's safe house. The report notes the files were transferred to London but adds, further dissemination restricted. British archives list no follow-up. Another OSS file mentions a packet marked Peenemünde, project materials, confiscated from Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg's quarters after the failed assassination. Its description matches technical outlines of V2 testing sites. Yet this evidence was never submitted in war crimes trials. Instead, it vanished into classified repositories, reappearing only in a 1953 CIA memorandum discussing early missile documentation obtained via Valkyrie sources. German testimonies confirm the existence of such caches. Fabian von Schlabrendorf, one of the surviving conspirators, testified after the war that several trunks of documents were hidden in Berlin's safe houses, intended for immediate delivery to Allied contacts. He believed at least 2 were seized by SS units, but others vanished before the Gestapo arrived. American intelligence officers operating in Berlin noted in debriefs that Allied hands received pre-compiled intelligence from German resistance circles, though they declined to specify the nature of the material. The implication is that portions of Valkyrie's shadow network succeeded, even as its leadership was executed. Why then were these records never made public? One explanation lies in their political sensitivity. By 1945, both the United States and Britain were already maneuvering for advantage in the coming Cold War. Lists of Gestapo officers might have been more useful as recruitment tools than courtroom evidence. Technical files from Peenemünde carried strategic value for missile development, and documentation of war crimes implicating not only SS but Wehrmacht units could have undermined Allied efforts to rebuild West Germany as a partner state. In this light, suppression was not an accident but a calculated choice. Soviet archives provide another angle. A 1946 NKVD report complained of Anglo-American concealment of Valkyrie intelligence, specifically noting that Allied forces withheld materials relating to Nazi crimes in the East. The Soviets demanded access under the terms of joint tribunals, but no such cooperation occurred. The absence of these files at Nuremberg is telling. While evidence of atrocities was abundant, the shadow network's lists could have traced culpability higher into Wehrmacht circles, complicating the post-war political landscape. Instead, silence prevailed. One particularly disturbing gap concerns the camps. Resistance members sympathetic to Valkyrie had reportedly compiled lists of sites and personnel tied to forced labor programs. An unpublished memorandum from the US War Refugee Board, discovered in the 1970s, refers to conspiratorial German records on labor camps received in August 1944. These, the memo claims, confirmed locations later liberated by the Soviets, yet they were never introduced as evidence, nor cited in official liberation reports. If genuine, they represent one of the earliest Western confirmations of mass atrocities, buried to protect sources or political convenience. The trail did not end in 1945. In 1958, a NATO counterintelligence briefing referenced residual Valkyrie contacts integrated into Western intelligence structures. No names were listed, but the language suggests that some conspirators' networks were quietly absorbed. Former officers who had risked everything to depose Hitler may have found a second life as informants in the new order, their wartime betrayals recast as assets against the Soviet Union. It explains why the shadow network files disappeared into classified vaults. They were not history to be preserved, but tools to be exploited. Civilian witnesses add texture to the silence. Residents of Berlin recalled Allied officers arriving at abandoned apartments in August 1944, carting away trunks of papers. One woman, interviewed in 1969, described seeing boxes labeled Persönlich, Oberst I.G. Stauffenberg. She remembered the Americans carrying them into trucks and never returning. Her testimony aligns with OSS records that mention Berlin's seizures coordinated with Valkyrie remnants. The material, once intended as proof against tyranny, was thus consumed by the machinery of intelligence. What remains today are fragments, enough to suggest the shadow network was real. Its purpose was to collapse the Nazi regime and provide allies with immediate evidence of war crimes and military secrets. Its failure meant executions for its leaders, but its surviving documents slipped into Allied custody. That they never reached the tribunals is less an oversight than a reflection of shifting priorities. As one declassified British Foreign Office memo from 1947 put it, the Valkyrie enclosures contain material of such sensitivity that their publication would prove detrimental to present diplomatic objectives. The legacy of Codename. Valkyrie is remembered as a dramatic assassination attempt. But in the shadows, It was also an intelligence operation, one whose records remain sealed in Western archives. The absence of these files at Nuremberg shaped the narrative of guilt, limiting its reach, redirecting culpability, and enabling the rapid reintegration of Germany into the Western Alliance. The Shadow Network's intelligence did not vanish. It was absorbed, repurposed, and locked away. What the world remembers is the bomb under Hitler's table. What it forgets is the paper trail meant to expose an empire of crimes, a trail hidden not by failure, but by deliberate design. When the archives close, the story does not end. It lingers in the gaps where explanation should live. What remains unspoken is often more dangerous than what is confessed. Empty chambers that echo with questions, photographs cut to remove faces, and reports filed under numbers that lead nowhere. These absences are not oversights, but deliberate constructions, walls built to keep certain truths from reaching the light. In the distance between rumour and record lies a realm of secrets, suspended like shadows that never fade. It is in this uneasy space where loyalty bends, where ambition eclipses morality, and where the line between protector and perpetrator dissolves into ash. The silence surrounding these fragments is not passive. It is alive, pressing outward, daring someone to listen. And when the silence is broken, even for a moment, what emerges is not closure, but a reminder. Some histories are written to be remembered, and others are written to be forgotten.